Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Megan Meadows, and I am the Director of the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services and the Administration for Children and Family. On behalf of the division, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on using the LIHEAP Data Warehouse and Performance Management website to inform program planning. Today's webinar is presented by members of the LIHEAP Performance Management and Implementation Work Group, and the Office of Community Services truly appreciates everyone's presentations today and their continued participation in the work group. Today, you will also hear from Melissa Torgerson of Verb Associates and Dan Bausch of Apprise, who each support the work group team. Next slide, please. The purpose of today's webinar is to show how the LIHEAP Data Warehouse and Performance Management website can be used by state grant recipients for federal fiscal year 25 planning and for completing the FY25 LIHEAP model plan. Our presenters will each share tools developed by the work group that informed their program operations. The audience for today's webinar is state LIHEAP coordinators and program staff that assist with planning or with completing the model plan. If you have staff unable to attend or you would like to view this webinar again, a recording will be available on the ACF YouTube channel. We greatly appreciate you joining us today and hope our presentation is valuable for your future planning. Melissa, please take it away.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. We know this is a busy time of year, and so we're glad you're here with us today. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes long, and the slides that you all are going to look at during this webinar are available for download now in the handout section of the GoToWebinar sidebar. We will be recording this session, and it will be available on the ACF YouTube channel. So if you want to review again or share with staff members, you're welcome to do so. So throughout the webinar, we encourage you to ask questions in the GoToWebinar question box. There's a little graphic here on, if you don't see the question box, how to go ahead and expand your sidebar so that you can see it. As you type questions, they'll be reviewed by the team, and they'll be either directed to the right person to be answered during the webinar. And if we can't get to it during the webinar, we will be sure to get a hold of you after the webinar and answer your questions. So I'm not going to go through this slide name by name, but I wanted to first of all point out how many awesome people are presenting as part of this webinar today. It is largely the product of your peers' hard work, and so I'm excited to be part of this. And this is kind of a table of contents so that when you decide you really want to go back and think again about something you heard today, you can go into this slide and see exactly where to find it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction just to provide some context for the great presentations you're about to hear. And we want to start by talking about reporting and how over the last 15 years especially, OCS has really tried to make reporting a two-way street. So for example, all of you work really hard to provide data to OCS that is accurate and timely, and OCS uses this data to prepare different reports for Congress, answer questions that come in on the fly for the administration and Congress and other stakeholders. But OCS has also worked really hard to take that data and make it accessible to you in a way that you can use it through either the performance management website, or through dashboards on the OCS website that you can use to then look at historical data and plan your program and to talk about your program. And that's really what you're going to hear about today, because we see two primary uses of LIHEAP performance data in the field. The first is internal, and perhaps the most important, because what we developed these measures for so many years ago was so that all of you could look at your performance, look at how LIHEAP is reaching the people who need it most, and then change or alter or tweak, if necessary, your program to do a better job. And so that's the internal use. You look at your program, whether you're meeting your goals, and you make decisions based on that information. But it's also very valuable to tell the LIHEAP story. And so explaining to people in your state about what this program is doing for you, how benefits are delivered to clients, and whether you've effectively targeted benefits to vulnerable groups and high burden households. Now, the work group was put together back in 2010, which seems forever ago, and they worked really hard to say, how do we help grantees take all of this data from past and present and use it and look at it in a way that's meaningful to them? And they've put together all kinds of tools to help you do this, and that includes the LIHEAP data warehouse, grantee profiles, executive summaries, the virtual library, and many more. And we're going to talk about a lot of those today in each of your peers' presentations. And we're going to start with the grantee profiles and executive summaries. So what the grantee profile does is, if you go to the performance management website, we'll show you one in here in just a second, and it's a one kind of click report, and it furnishes kind of this fact sheet or one-page report about your program, and it's a really nice comprehensive picture of what your program looks like. Now, the performance management snapshot and executive summary looks at key statistics regarding your performance indicators. So it moves beyond the fact sheet, which talks about what your program does, and the snapshot and executive summary begin to look at what impact your program is having on the people that you're serving. And right now, Brian Worrell, who's a LIHEAP and SNAP and all-around extraordinaire from the state of Pennsylvania, is going to talk about how he's used these tools to illustrate or tell his LIHEAP story in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Melissa. So as Melissa said, I'm going to cover these two tools, and they really are great tools that some of you are probably familiar with. Others of you who are newer may not be fully aware of, but they do a great job of showing some basic LIHEAP data, but in a really easily digestible way. So the grantee profiles use the household and funding data from the federal reports to summarize key metrics of the LIHEAP program in a given fiscal year. So each year, a prize uses the household report and the grantee survey from the prior fiscal year to create a grantee profile for each grant recipient. The profiles include a range of information to provide grant recipients with a comprehensive snapshot of their programs. This includes such metrics as the total funding and allocation of funds for the program, the allocation of funds allocated to different program components, the number of eligible households and households served, the vulnerable population served, the average benefits by program component, and the historical data on funding. And so one of the most useful applications of the grantee profile is that it allows you to easily provide information to your administration and other stakeholders. So this is Pennsylvania's grantee profile from fiscal year 2023. On the left, you can see information about our program overall. So for example, you can see that in fiscal year 23, our total funding was about $334 million, and that we served nearly 313,000 households. And of that, we served 36% of our income eligible population, which is over 870,000 households in Pennsylvania. Here we can see how our funding has changed over the past 5 years. Obviously, we can see the big spike to 530 with the ARPA funding, and then the 479 and 334, as we came back down into post-COVID world. And so this shows how we, in the center, you can see we allocated our funds to different program components. So first we have 42% of our funding went towards heating assistance, 42% went towards crisis assistance, and 1% went towards weatherization. And so the grantee profile then also shows you a share of served households that have different types of vulnerable members. So for example, you can see that 41% of households we served in fiscal year 23 had an elderly member, 18% had a young child, and 73% had at least one vulnerable member of any kind. and 30% disabled. I obviously glossed over that. Finally, at the bottom, you can see that the number of households served and average benefit for different benefit assistance types. So over 310,000 households received heating assistance with an average benefit of $450. Winter crisis assistance, we served 98,771 households with an average benefit of $1,005. And we provide weatherization assistance to 400 households with an average benefit of about $9,332. And so, again, like I was saying, what this really does and what we use it for in Pennsylvania is it really shows a good breakdown of how you're using those funds. And, you know, if you look back, because these are all stored in the performance management website that are available to you, you can go back over multiple years and do a comparison from year to year and see how you've consistently been using those benefits, and that will allow you to better plan for future years as you continue to administer the program. So, you know, this is actually a little bit abnormal for Pennsylvania, this 42% heating, 42% crisis. That was because of some of the program parameters we had in that year because of all the extra funding. You know, but in previous years, it gets to more of a 2/3 to 1/3 breakdown when looking at just the heating assistance and the crisis assistance, and that's been fairly consistent for us. And so those are the sort of trends you want to look at so that you know, oh, well, you know, if this continues and we are continuing to see about an even split between heating and crisis, we know in Pennsylvania that we have to update our state plan projections to account for the fact that we're spending about the same on regular heating assistance and the same amount on crisis assistance, and adjust our benefits accordingly and our planning accordingly. So one more, they jumped a little bit ahead. I had one more thing to say that I forgot. One more thing about the grantee profiles. This is obviously a nice little heads up for Pennsylvania's, but Apprise will be sending out the fiscal year 23 grantee profiles soon for everybody. You know, Apprise can also develop a fiscal year 24 grantee profile for you if you have the necessary data available. So now we can move on. So the other tool I'm going to talk about here today is the executive summary. This is a one-page snapshot of key performance measure data, including information such as the energy burn before and after LIHEAP assistance, the share of the home energy bill that is reduced by LIHEAP, the energy statistics for higher burdened households, the prevention and restoration of home energy service loss because of bill payment assistance and equipment repair or replacement, and a few other things. So essentially, the executive summary answers two important questions. Does your LIHEAP program furnish higher benefits to higher burdened households? And does your LIHEAP program pay a larger share of the home energy bill for higher burdened households? So this is, again, a little bit advanced Pennsylvania's executive summary for fiscal year 23. You can see in the top left how it provides information on key performance indicators that answer those two questions. For the first question, does LIHEAP furnish benefits to higher burdened households? In Pennsylvania's case, the answer is yes. High burdened households received a benefit that was about 50% higher than the average benefit received by all households. And for the second question, does LIHEAP pay a larger share of the home energy bill for high burdened households? Again, for Pennsylvania, the answer is yes. In fiscal year 23, the average high burdened household received a benefit that covered about 33% of their energy bill compared to just 31% for the average household overall. The executive summary also provides a chart that displays the metrics that underpin these two key indicators, comparing the metrics across all households and high burden households. These are metrics such as the average energy bill, income, and LIHEAP benefit, the percent of the energy bill paid by LIHEAP, and the energy burden before and after receiving LIHEAP. And finally, in the lower half of the executive summary, there's information about prevention and restoration of home energy service loss. And so what I really like to use this particular form for is, again, I mean, really those first two questions, because these are both, you know, tied in closely to the assurances that we attest to every year. And I will say, you know, when you get this data, you know, it is not to call you out or, you know, it's just to, again, it's an informational tool for you so that you can easily recognize where you might need to look at improving your program. I will say for Pennsylvania, I'm open about the fact that that second question, does LIHEAP pay a larger share of home energy bill for high burden households? That actually has flip-flopped back and forth for us a few times between yes and no. We are always pretty close, and that's just because of the way that our benefit matrix is structured in Pennsylvania. And so that is something that, we do continuously monitor when we get these snapshots so that we can look at for the next year, what changes do we need to move to get back to that yes answer for that second question. So together, the grantee profile and the executive summary offer vital snapshots of key metrics and performance measures for your LIHEAP program. These tools are instrumental in providing grant recipients and stakeholders with a comprehensive overview of important program information. In the rest of the presentation, the other speakers are going to take a deeper dive on 3 of the most important topics covered by the grantee profile and this executive summary: funding allocation, targeting benefits toward vulnerable populations, and targeting benefits towards high-burden households.
Thanks, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, one of the very first things in your model plan, if you want to go to the next slide, Nick, is determining your funding allocations. And so many of you will recognize this cool little table. What this asks you to do is to estimate the percentage of your funds that you're going to be dedicating to each of these components in the upcoming year. Now, next slide, please. When you think ahead, it's helpful to sometimes take a look back. And some of the questions that we think are important to be asking are how did we allocate funds for 2024? And based on the 2024 data, sorry, let me clarify. How did we plan to allocate funds and how did we actually allocate funds? And if there's a difference, why? Did we overestimate the amount that we were going to use in one area? Did we have a colder winter or higher fuel prices than we expected? Did we have a warmer summer? Did we get more money than we had planned on? There are all kinds of reasons and contexts that you have that someone looking at a report doesn't. And so it's important that as you use data to look at this information and go back over, trends over the years, that you're doing so with as much context as you have to understand what different factors may have influenced changes that you see. Now, one of the things, if you were at the recent NIHEAP training, or if you've been in our trainings in the past, we always say that it's useful to anticipate that changes will happen during the year or that your funding needs will vary. And so it's a good practice to include in your state plan what you might need to do in different circumstances. So for example, you can include contingency type language in your plan to say, if prices are low or we don't spend all of our money here in this area, we plan to perhaps do supplemental benefits or implement a cooling program. So it's okay to put that in your plan. It's okay to hold that outside your plan too. But the idea is to be thinking ahead and to use historical data to inform that thought. And with that, we're going to share in the next part of the presentation some of this data that you can look at that's readily accessible to you. And most of it is on the LIHEAP clearinghouse and the data warehouse. On the clearinghouse, what you're going to find are state plans, and not just for your state, but for many states. So you can go in and look at what those planned allocations were. This is especially helpful for some of you who are in offices where you're brand new and you may not know where to find the old plans. And yes, it does happen. So it's great that there are these resources where you can actually go back and look at historical documents as well as other states to see how they're doing it. There's also the data warehouse, and this is where you're going to see your actual allocation. And so this information is taken from your grantee survey and where you are talking about where you actually obligated funds. And then you also have internal records, and that kind of thing may be the information you're gathering or your budget to look at what your projected actuals are. So there's all kinds of information available internally in your own office as well as publicly that you can go take a look at to inform your planning moving forward. And Jane Blank from Wisconsin, many of you know her, will be presenting on how her state used funding information from the data warehouse as well as their internal records to think about and inform their planned allocations for the 2025 program year. So Jane, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. This is Jane. I'm here to talk about how Wisconsin used the data warehouse, internal information, when considering the 25 allocation percentages. I want to start with the table that breaks down how allocations were planned for 23 and 24 versus how funds were spent. We planned to allocate the same share of funds in 23 and 24. Meanwhile, our actual expenditures varied. So under our expenditures, we spent more for heating assistance in 23 than planned, but in 24 so far, we spent a smaller share for heating. Our program adapts to circumstances in the year, as was mentioned, despite how we plan to use our funds, whether our total available funds have changed, whether a crisis requires us to serve households differently. There's so many factors that can change how programs operate. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on this point in the next slide. This is a chart that shows how we allocated our funds to heating, cooling, crisis, weatherization, and other uses from 2019 through 2023. You can see our division of funds remained the same in 2019 and 2020. It's useful to look at these years because it's before COVID-19 changed how our program ran and many other programs across the nation. In 2021, by contrast, you can see a big jump in our use of funds for crisis. This bar represents 2021, and this year our program had to adapt to the effects of COVID. We were allotted more federal funding to ensure that people remained safe in their home and had access to home energy. Our program also used federal funding to pay arrearages to ensure that customers maintained access to energy, and if they were behind in their bills, that they wouldn't be shut out of service. Since 2021, a larger portion of funds were spent towards crisis assistance, as a number of households still struggled with their bills and required assistance to maintain access to their home energy. So we continued to issue additional crisis to provide that additional follow-up support. Next slide, please. So in this chart, our average benefits for heating and crisis illustrate our adapted program operations. Again, as you can see, in 2019 and 2020, the average benefit for heating and crisis were closely aligned. Starting in 2021, the average benefit for crisis assistance increased more than the average benefit for heating assistance. The average benefit for crisis is higher because those funds went to pay for those higher bill amounts and those overdue bills for customers. As I mentioned, this continued a little bit also into 2022 as well. Despite how we plan to use available funds, our program has to adapt, which was the case in 21 and 22. Also, as we planned for 24, it was useful to look back at what was spent in 2019 and 2020, because the 2024 funding was anticipated to be closer to the pre-pandemic or the 2019 and 2020 funding. And Melissa, I think it goes back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. So one of the things I just want to underscore, in the past, we presented some similar information because what we were seeing is that many of you were cloning the prior year's state or model plans and saying, oh, we'll probably allocate about the same percentages, so we'll just leave them the same. And what we are trying to say is that there is a way to look back and say, look, if our numbers are really different, maybe we need to consider changing them in our model plan as well. But also recognizing exactly what Jane said, which is this is a plan, right? And so even if you may have spent funds differently in prior years than you had planned, there are reasons for that in many cases, and those reasons may not be in place anymore, or you may have different circumstances. So it's about finding a balance between not just clicking what you clicked last year to save time, but also recognizing that there will be different circumstances that change things, both historically and moving forward. And now let's go ahead and look. Do we have any questions, Nicholas? No, it doesn't look like it.
No questions.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move ahead now to using the data warehouse to target vulnerable populations. And just a reminder, the LIHEAP statute talks about a lot in a lot of different places about vulnerable household members. And so, for example, when we talk about targeting benefits, we say that we're going to pay, we're going to make payments to people who don't exceed a certain income, but that the state may also give priority to those households with the highest home energy costs or needs. And later in the statute, it talks about how highest home energy needs looks at both energy burden, but also the unique situation of households that result from having members of vulnerable populations, including young children, individuals with disabilities, and frail older individuals. And so when you see targeting, if you want to go to the next slide, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. If you see targeting, there are two different ways that states and tribes and territories really target. They target through outreach, so making sure people have access to the applications, whether it be early or easier applications, but they can also give higher benefits. So there are really two different paths that people take in terms of giving people priority. And in order to understand whether you're reaching targeted populations and even what your targeted population should be, you need information and data. And so the grantee profile that Brian went over at the beginning of the session breaks down the households, the assisted households, and which had vulnerable members. But the data warehouse can get you much more granular information. So for example, they can get you eligible population figures by vulnerability, which means we can look at who's eligible, whether you served them or not, as well as assisted households by vulnerable status. And then finally, comparing these two. So when you compare the amount of eligible vulnerable households to the amount of assisted vulnerable households, what does that look like? And how well are you reaching them? So Teresa and Michelle from Colorado and Arkansas respectively are going to present how they've used household data from the data warehouse to inform their targeting efforts. And I believe we're starting with Teresa, right?
Yes.
Great, thanks
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everybody. This is Teresa from the wonderful state of Colorado. I'm going to be talking about using the data warehouse to assess trends in Colorado's targeting of vulnerable populations, specifically how we've targeted eligible households with young children. As Melissa said, we'll be showing various charts from the data warehouse that we built using federal reporting data. Let's start with our first chart, which shows us the total number of eligible households with a young child that resides in the state of Colorado. You can see that the total number of eligible households with a young child has trended downward. The state had around 94,500 households with a young child in 2019, which decreased to about 78,400 households by 2023. Next slide, please. However, even though the number of eligible households with a young child decreased from 2019 to 2023, over this same time period, Colorado has actually steadily increased the number of households with a young child served. Going from around 11,300 in 2019 to around 12,600 households in 2023. Next slide, please. This last chart compares the share of eligible households that Colorado has served to the share of eligible households with a child under 5 served. Here, the light blue bars represent the overall percent served, and the dark blue are the percentage with a young child served. As you can see, the overall share of eligible households that we've assisted has trended upwards over the last few years, as has the share of eligible households with a young child. In 2019, we served around 12% of all eligible households, as well as 12% of eligible households with a young child. By 2023, 17% of all eligible households were served, while 16% of eligible households with a young child were served. Next slide, please. So overall, Colorado has served a larger and larger share of eligible households with a young child over time. But as we saw, the average share of all eligible households served is higher. So even though Colorado is trending in the right direction, we're still investigating how to target a higher share of households with young children. And now I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Gillum, who is going to talk about Arkansas.
Thanks, Teresa. Like Teresa said, my name is Michelle Gillum, and I'm representing Arkansas. And in the charts that I'm going to show you, they're going to look very similar to Colorado, but you're going to see where the data shows some variables specific to our state. So what I'm going to show you in the upcoming charts is how we use the data warehouse to look at trends in how Arkansas targeted vulnerable populations. Again, we're going to show you how we focused on how we targeted eligible households with young children. So this first chart shows the federally income eligible households that had a child under 5. You'll see that the number of eligible households with a child has decreased over the years. On the far left of the chart for FFY 2019, we had about 62,000 federally income eligible households that had a child in Arkansas. But then we moved to the 2023 chart and we see we only had 52,000 eligible households with a young child. So let's go on to the next slide. This one, we're going to see that the number of households served with young children. In the last few years, the number that we've assisted with young children has fluctuated. While we had more than 6,200 households in 2019 that were assisted, the number dipped to around 4,100 in 2021, and then it climbed back up in 2023 to about 5,600. So we've got some up and down there. Next slide, please. So this is our final chart. Just like Teresa had in hers, we're going to compare the share of eligible households served to those households that were served with a young child. Again, the light blue bars represent the overall percent served. The dark blue are the percent with the young child served. So the chart is going to show us the share of all eligible households in Arkansas has hovered around 14%. It really hasn't changed that much. But then when we start looking at the share of eligible households with a young child that was served, it's a good bit smaller and it fluctuates between 7 and 11%. We did see an increase over the last couple of years. Since 2021, we've seen a marked increase. Let's go to the next slide, please. And by looking at the data warehouse information, we can see that Arkansas has maintained about the same share of eligible households served over the past few years, but we served a relatively smaller share of eligible households with a young child. While we've seen that improvement over the last couple of years, we still have more progress to make in targeting this particular vulnerable population to make sure that we are adequately serving them. So we're able to use this data warehouse as intended to look at our numbers and target these households like we want to. And I'm going to hand it back over to Melissa.
Thanks, Michelle. So, one of the things that we didn't want to get into the nitty gritty of how to go in and produce these charts, but as you'll hear from Dan later, there's assistance to do this, both in terms of tutorials as well as in-person assistance if you'd like. So if you're seeing these things and thinking, I'd love to do this, but I do not have time, or I do not even know where to go, to start, we're going to give you some links at the end, but also just keep in mind that there's a lot of help available to help generate these statistics for you so that you can use them as you're working on your plan.
Melissa,
So now, yes, go ahead.
We actually have a question. So besides young children households, what other vulnerable types are available?
So I'll start and then Dan, you can jump in. So the three that are defined by the statute and that are in the data warehouse include elderly households, as well as households with a disabled member. And so you can go in and look at each of those individually. And I believe, Dan, you can also go in and look at households with any of those three vulnerabilities. Is that correct?
That's correct, yep.
Great. You can also just look at eligible households overall, right? So how many eligible households are in our state and versus how many are we serving and how has that changed over time? So there's a lot of different ways you can look at this data.
Yeah, you can also look at you can also look at poverty levels. So how many households do you serve that are at or below 75% of poverty, for example, and how many are there in the population in your state?
And that can be particularly helpful when you have advocates that are saying we need to raise the income or we need to lower the income threshold, eligibility threshold in our state. That information can be particularly valuable to show where those eligible households are and how you've been serving them in past years.
Yeah, and we're working now as you all are reporting new information to OCS through the household report. We're going to be working on adding new information to the data warehouse so you're able to access that and use that.
Awesome. So now let's talk about targeting benefits. We already mentioned once that a big goal of the LIHEAP program is to make sure you're targeting services to households based on their home energy need, which includes vulnerable status, but it also includes energy burden. And so for example, Assurance 5 in particular tells grantees or grant recipients that they must furnish the highest level of assistance or benefits to households which have the lowest income and the highest energy costs in relation to that income. So basically those households that are paying the largest share of their income towards energy costs are the people we're supposed to be targeting higher benefits to. Go to the next. And so what this means and how you make this happen is you provide larger benefits to households with lower incomes and larger household size, as well as larger benefits to households with more expensive heating fuels or higher energy bills. And the data that you all are working so hard to collect provide you with the information you need to make sure that this is happening in your benefit matrix. So for example, you're collecting income data from all of your households, including those that are categorically eligible. So you have a good idea of what people's incomes are, and you can target benefits based or to those with the lowest incomes. You also have energy cost information. For the performance measures, you are required to collect annual home energy costs from vendors. And what this does is it allows you to look at average costs of heating fuels and which are the most expensive for households. Now, we know that there are increases and these can be really sudden. So those aside, what you can do is look at averages over the years and be able to see which are the highest heating fuels and am I accounting for that in my benefit matrix? So benefit targeting is something that requires annual revisiting. And that's hard for some people to hear because they're not doing that currently. It's a lot of work for some people, or they're not quite sure how to get started. And but in order to accurately target benefits, you need to have a pretty good idea of how incomes among your households are changing, as well as energy prices. Now, states do this differently. Minnesota has for more than 20 years analyzed client expenditure data, so they're kind of ahead of the pack. And they've done a good job of targeting benefits, but what you're going to hear, I believe, from Ian is that they're always working on improving this. Now, Georgia has been working on targeting their benefits, and Cynthia is going to talk about how her state looked at their matrix and kind of overhauled it and is continuing to evaluate whether or not that's working and other changes they would like to see. All of this, once again, information is in the data warehouse, a lot of it. And so both Ian and Cynthia are going to show you the kind of data that you can pull. And I also just want to make a quick plug here that if you're going to NUAC in Chicago in a couple of weeks, there will be a whole session on benefit determination and matrices, so you can see how different states award benefits differently to a similar household. And so that might be really useful for some of you to attend. But right now, I'm going to hand it over to Ian, I believe, who's going to present for his state of Minnesota.
All right, thank you. So earlier you heard from Brian Worrell that the PMI-WG has developed this tool we call the executive summary of your performance management snapshot. So this is Minnesota's right here. And I want to echo what Brian said and just mention, there's a lot of great information in here that tells us about how our state targets our benefits, what our impact on energy burden is. I think this is great for getting sort of a high level view of our benefit. We're doing program planning to check on things like, does our benefit keep up with the energy costs we see in our state? Does it make sense? And Minnesota was very pleased to see that in our FY23 snapshot that it says, yes, we do give higher benefits to higher burden households. So you can see from the information here that we award benefits that are more than 54% larger to our higher burden households. And also our snapshot says, yes, we pay a larger share of the home energy bill for those households. Next slide, please. So one of the things that Melissa went over is that developing an effective benefit matrix requires understanding the impact of a household's main heating fuel on their energy costs. And so that information for Minnesota is shown here. And you can actually make this slide on your own using the data warehouse, or you can also work with Dan's team to sort of figure out how that works. And what we're going to show here in yellow is that in Minnesota, the average energy cost for households that heat primarily with delivered fuels like propane or fuel oil is quite a bit higher than what you see for households who are heating with natural gas or electricity. And next slide, please. So we have worked very hard to make sure that we award larger benefits to households with higher costs. And what you see here is that when you look at the benefits that we're awarding for households using those high cost fuels, the average benefit is higher than what we award to households using lower cost fuels. Next slide, please. So the last point I'll touch on here is that it's not enough though to just vary the benefits that you award by a household's main heating fuel. So you also need to make sure that you're giving higher benefits to households with the lowest incomes. And so in Minnesota, we have a formula where to award a benefit, we basically figure out a percentage of a household's energy costs that we're going to pay. And that percentage goes up as income goes down, in a nutshell. You can contact me to learn more about how that works. I'd be happy to talk your ear off. But what you see in the chart here is that, for each of the main heating fuels, we are paying a higher benefit to higher burden households, which is exactly what we want. And sort of in reference to what Melissa said, this is something that we continuously try and refine and make tweaks to. It can be really challenging to award benefits, especially to households with high cost fuels that take a meaningful bite out of the energy burden they have. So there's a lot of tweaking and continuous improvement that we're doing there. And at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Cynthia Bryant, who's going to talk about Georgia.
Thanks, Ann. Hello, everyone. This is Cynthia from the Peach State of Georgia. And I am also going to start with our executive summary. And I'll tell you, I wasn't really particularly happy when I looked at it because, as you see in the top left, Georgia did not furnish higher benefits to higher burden households, nor did we pay a larger share of the home energy bill for higher burden households. In fact, our data shows that higher burden households received an average benefit of $857, which is lower than the average benefit for households, for all households. Next slide, please. We are one of the states just starting to collect data on the relative energy costs for households by main heating fuel. Just as you saw with Ian's chart, on the residential bill amount, households in Georgia that heat with electricity have a much lower energy bill, while households that use fuel oil and propane pay an average energy bill that is 50% higher. Next slide. Here we see the average benefit and bill by main heating fuel type. You can see that the benefit amount in orange is the same across fuel types, even if the bill amount seen in blue is much higher. I'm sure I'm not the only grant recipient who is unhappy that higher bills receive the same benefit amount. Next slide. As if that wasn't bad enough, when we look at the chart comparing benefits for all households to benefits for high burden households, we see that the average benefit across fuel types for high burden households, seen in green, is lower than the benefit for all households, seen in orange. And this is why we reached out to Melissa to help us update our benefit matrix for federal fiscal year 24. I am excited to see how our performance has changed, and I'm looking forward to being able to answer yes to those two key questions. Yes, we do for higher burden households, and yes, we do pay a larger share of the energy bill for higher burden households. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dan from Apprise, who has some final reminders for everyone.
Okay, hello everybody. All right, some final reminders for you all before we turn to questions. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them in the chat now. We've talked about a lot of different resources that the Performance Management Implementation Work Group and OCS have developed. Those resources are available, but we want you to know that there is assistance to help you to find them, to help you to understand them, to help you to use them, and to help have your staff become familiar with them. First, in the last few days, you or the LIHEAP coordinator for your state should have received an email with your 2023 performance measures executive summaries. Those are the short documents that Ian and Cynthia just showed. Those documents have the most recent data that you submitted, and we'll answer those 2 questions about your targeting. If you didn't receive them, or if you need help understanding them, we're here to help you to use those and to help you understand them. We're also working now on the grantee profiles that summarize program activity during fiscal year 2023. Those will be coming soon, and we will be adding all of the 2023 data into the data warehouse. So that process is underway, and then you'll be able to build charts like the examples you saw here. We also are working on data tutorials to help you to recreate charts like those shown today, and to understand and use the navigation menu and the different options in the data warehouse. There is a resource section in the data warehouse now that has some helpful information for you if you're playing around in the data warehouse and looking to build charts. But we want you to know that staff at Apprise are available to help you if you're trying to find information in the data warehouse, you can't find it. If you need a chart quickly for a meeting, or you're trying to find information, like I need information on vulnerable households and what the trend line is for my state, we are here to help you with that. And you can reach out to any of us at Apprise so that we can do that. We can also schedule a meeting and hop on the phone with you to go over anything related to the data warehouse, creating reports, or understanding how to interpret a chart. If you need training and technical assistance, please reach out to us. We encourage you to do that. This is a great slide. If you download the slides and the handouts, these are all links you can click on to get to the data warehouse, to get to the performance management website, as well as to find who your OCS liaison is if you're newer to the program, and also to find other resources on the required federal reports and other resources that the work group has made to help you with performance management and with understanding your data for your state. So we have a few minutes now. Here's how you can enter questions or ask a question, and we will turn it to Kevin to see what questions we have.
All right, so far we have one question. Are we able to get help understanding why our data is showing what it is showing?
Yeah, I'll start, and then maybe Melissa can jump in. So oftentimes people can get the data, you can receive the executive summary or the profile, and that'll show you information, but you may not know why it's looking the way it is, especially if you're newer to the program and you're looking at something that occurred in the past or a trend line that's been occurring over a few years. We're happy to help look into your data to try to understand what might be the cause of those things, or at least where to point you so you can look into them further. So we are definitely happy with trying to help you understand how to interpret the information.
I would just add that we can also oftentimes share examples of how other states made certain changes to their programs to change those numbers. So for example, if you see you're not targeting, we can say, here are the reasons we think why, and here are how some other states addressed that with big or little changes to their programs.
We have another question. Where do the performance measures come from?
Melissa, I think you're well placed to speak to this one.
So I'm not sure so I'm going to answer it, but whoever asks a question can tell me if I'm not answering their question. So the performance measures, I'll start with the data. So how we generate your measures come directly from the performance data form that you complete, and that's part 2 of the performance data form. So this is where we use, the income, average annual LIHEAP benefit, and all that information from your energy vendors on annual energy costs to come up with performance measures, both for all households and your highest burden households. And then all of that is summarized and put into that executive summary that both Brian and Ian talked about, as well as Cynthia. Now, if you're asking me the larger question, who dreamt up these performance measures, many of the people on this call are part of that work group who actually came up with the measures and developed them and got them through OMB clearance with OCS. And so I answered the question in 2 different ways. I'm hoping I answered it for whoever asked.
We have another question. You mentioned assistance with the benefit matrix. Can you tell me more about how a prize can help us with planning and for the future?
This is, this is
No,
Dan. I'll
yeah.
start and then let Melissa help. So yeah, we do often, we speak to states that are interested and are looking at their matrix and trying to figure out how to improve their targeting results. So I think that starts with conversations and looking at your data to see what it tells you and speak with you about that. But we also do provide assistance to states with looking at how tweaks or changes to their factors or their matrices could impact the assistance households are receiving. So some of that is looking at simulations and other things with your recent data to see how households' benefit levels would change under a different scenario.
This is David. I just want to highlight that OCS has explicitly made, so in our TNTA contract, OCS has explicitly instructed us that we should be working with grant recipients on their performance measures and their benefit matrices. So yes, we absolutely are scoped by OCS to get that done.
And I would, Cynthia, you can chime in here if you're still available, but I would take it a step further. Remember that performance management is about using information to think about and make changes. So we've talked a lot about data today and, hard numbers and graphs and tables, but there's a lot of other information like, gosh, we have a lot of households that are just coming in and asking for this, and that's not going to be in a table. Or you have intake workers who are seeing patterns in the field that aren't going to be captured in numbers. And so in Cynthia's case, when we redid hers, we proposed some changes, but we also helped her present it to her network of community action agencies. And she can speak to that, but having someone external present that information, we listened to what they said and we made further adjustments. Cynthia, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, it meant so much, just to have someone else be, we can present the data, but when someone else presents the data to the network, it just speaks volume. And it was really received. And so we were so appreciative because, throughout the year, we just take notes, a lot of things that, we didn't get from the data, but we got from the network, and making sure that we, took very good notes and had these notes available when we were starting to do our state plan.
Right, and once again, I can't underscore this enough. We put something down that looked really good on paper and made sense, but when we talked to the network about it, and this is important for your state and model plan in general, right? Things look really great on paper, but we found out, oh, this floor benefit or this cap we're putting on the benefit is too low. Right. And so I just would encourage you all, as you're looking at any of this data, that it needs to be taken with the advice of your folks who are working on the ground.
We have 2 more questions so far. First is, besides charts and the documents you provide, is there a way to get the underlying data to make our own charts or do our own analysis?
Yeah, this is Dan. So all the data that comes in the charts, all the data in the profiling executive summary are all available. You can download them in the data warehouse and get them in a spreadsheet and take them and use them in any way you want with your own internal data. It's, for the most part, data that you submitted on your federal reports, but there's also data that comes on the eligible population from census data sets, and that's made and prepared for you, and anyone can go and download it.
And one last question we have is, are we able to get our fiscal year 2024 grantee profile, since that seems more relevant?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you have your information on FY24 activity, the households you served, how you obligated the funds, we can, if you provide that and share that with us, we can go ahead and make the profile, the preliminary profile for you, so you can use it, share it with stakeholders. Because that hasn't yet been reported for FY24 in your federal LIHEAP reports, we don't have it to do it on our own, but if you can share it with us, we're happy to make that for you. And it looks like we are about at time. So I think if that's it, we can thank everyone for joining us today and for your time. We hope it was useful and you download the slides and can share it with others. And we look forward to speaking with you at our next webinar.